iGlobenews brings global views.
Welcome to iGlobenews, our weekly video podcast series where we discuss current events and world politics. My name is Diana Mountain-Markoff, and I'm the editor-in-chief of iGlobenews.org. And joining me this week, as every week, is Professor Susanne Weigelen-Schwierzig, the world-renowned China expert. And today we will be discussing a very interesting topic, the Gaza Flotilla, the Europe that can say no. And for the record, this session was recorded on May 24th, 2026. For nearly 2 decades, international activists have attempted to reach Gaza by sea in defiance of Israel's naval blockade. The movement began in 2006 and is a protest against the collective punishment of the Palestinians. Israel, of course, reasserts the lawfulness of its naval blockade of Gaza. Since 2010, every flotilla has been stopped by Israeli forces in international waters, which is, I may add, illegal. The deadliest incident occurred in 2010 when Israeli forces raided the Turkish ship Mavi Marmara, killing 10 activists and wounding dozens more. The latest mission involved 430 activists from 44 countries. It was the largest ever attempt to break through Israel's blockade. The flotilla was known as the Global Sumud, an Arabic word for steadfastness. Israel said that these activists were terrorists and bringing weapons to Hamas. Israel arrested 430 people on board 50 ships. A video of the Israeli security minister, Ben Gvir, mocking some of the activists and maltreating them in prison sparked international outcry calling for his resignation. Now France has barred him from entering the country. Allegations of kidnapping, rape, sexual abuse, being shot by rubber bullets at close range, and other forms of torture, such as being stripped, beaten, and denied access to legal counsel, were made. 5 French participants were hospitalized in Turkey, some with broken ribs or fractured vertebrae. The reaction from European countries, from Spain to Germany to Italy and Ireland, has been united in their horror on how the activists were treated, unlawfully detained in international waters and kidnapped. Also globally, many countries, which are usually allies of Israel, condemned what happened, including Brazil, Australia, and even India. Is this the moment European countries unite against Israel and call out the barbaric treatment of Palestinians? In your opinion, was the Global Sumud flotilla a success? Will Israel pay the price for violating international law, or will Europe once again turn a blind eye because the perpetrator is Israel?
Well, from my point of view, I think it is very difficult to assess whether or not this last attempt to go through the blockade of Israel was really a success. Because we see nowadays that sometimes while you are not successful in military or real means, you might be very successful with regard to your media image, with regard to your ability to project your soft power rather than your hard power. And so I think it's very difficult to assess for someone like me who is not part of the movement and so also not part of the anti-movement to really come to assessment of whether or not it was successful. But I think what should be discussed here in this context is actually to which extent it is right to say that international law that used to be the standard for everything you did in the international realm is still an instrument that can be used without having to explain why you use it and without having to explain how you use it. The natural way of referring to international law as a standard that everybody complies with, it seems to me that this time is over. And for that reason, I think especially regions and countries like Europe that relied very much on this legal narrative, always trying to assess something, whether or not it was in compliance with international law. I think Europe has an enormous difficulties in switching from one mode of assessment to the other. It's one of the reasons why I don't expect Europe to be united in either condemning Israel or in condemning the activists. It's very difficult to find standard that is not the activist standard or the Israeli standard, but a third standard. And in the past, we used to have this kind of third standard, which made it easy for people to assess the situation than it is at this moment. And I think that what we are seeing when we look at Israel is that they are already, or that they have for a longer period of time already been using the law of power rather than international law in order to pursue their interests. I think this is what we see with Donald Trump arguing very openly that, for him, the question of how can he make a deal, which always implies how can I impose my ideas on somebody else. So this is the way things are being treated at this moment. And I think we can see it in this special case too.
So when you talk about a third way, is this the law of the power? Others might call it the law of the jungle. The most powerful actor wins. Is that what you are considering this third way?
No, definitely not. I think that this so-called law of the jungle, which I'm not so sure that everybody really understands what it means, but it means the law written by those who are most powerful, right? And we can also say it's actually not a law, it's the rules of the game that are being defined by the most powerful. And in the past, we thought that international law was not the law of the most powerful, directed against those who were the least powerful. We thought that this was like a third way of looking at things. You didn't need to side with either side. You could sort of assess a situation by looking at it from the point of view of international law. And I think that these times are over. And of course, there are also people who say that, in the past, especially since the end of the Cold War, when the US didn't have a second competitor or a third competitor, but were in the unipolar moment the only country to dominate the world. In this situation, it was the US who actually defined the rules of the game. So international law was the law that was actually defined by the most powerful. But of course, the most powerful told us that this law is actually good for everybody who complies with it. For a certain period of time, I think that many people, including myself, had the impression that this idea was actually quite fruitful. But now we see that the US no longer even sticks to the rules it defined by itself. So I would say that behaving according to power standards always generates the victim and the perpetrator. And the third way to look at things would be to define a standard. And to a certain degree, I think it is a good idea to use the kind of standards we had in the past rather than being part of this jungle game where people just throw different views of reality against each other.
But legal orders are intrinsic. You either follow them or you don't follow them. You can't be a little bit pregnant. You know what I mean? So you either follow international law or you don't follow international law. You can't kind of follow it a little bit or halfway, because otherwise it's just not followed. Then you don't follow it. That's my opinion. So you either comply with it
Yes, but I
or you
think
don't
you still
comply.
misunderstood me. I'm not saying that you can use this a little bit or not. I think from a pragmatic point of view, in this situation where certain countries actually try to redefine the rules of the game by redefining their position in the international order, in this situation, it is pragmatically sound to actually stick to what we call international law. Despite the fact that if you analyze the emergence of the kind of international law that has been our guardrails for the last, let's say, 30 years, when you look at those, you will realize that, of course, in the unipolar moment where the US had enough power to define the rules of the game, these rules, including international law, were very much defined or at least impacted by the interests that the US had in ruling the world. But on the other hand, in this period, up until maybe 2017, US was actually very much focused on trying to convince us that sticking to international law was not only good for them, but also good for us, right? So they were also sort of adjusting their definitions of what is good and bad in terms of international law, not only to their interests, but they also had to take into consideration that they don't create too many enemies against them. So this was how the US proceeded until approximately 2017, with the beginning of the trade war against China. They started changing their position and they started changing the validity of international law. And it started with China, and now we see that it is all over the world that they are redefining, also openly redefining their position towards international law. So what I was trying to say is that from a pragmatical point of view, if you adhere to international law, you actually take a position that is neither a position of the perpetrator nor the position of the victim, but you assess the situation from a point of view that is not part and parcel of the process you are assessing. I think this is very, very important because many people actually assess a certain process as part of the process themselves, which is totally okay. I mean, for people who are being victimized, it's understandable that they want to be regarded as victims in this situation and that they assess the situation from their victim point of view. And for people who are the perpetrators, it's very clear that they want to get their message across, right? But there have to be people who actually look at the situation without being victim and without being perpetrator, because we see, no matter whether we look at Gaza, whether we look at Iran, whether we look at Ukraine, that victim and perpetrator, if they don't have a third position sort of talking with both sides, will at this moment not come to any solution of the problem. And that's why we need the third standard. And for that reason, I would argue it is important to pragmatically use international law, although we know about the limitations of it.
So I think I'm understanding where you're coming from. And of course, effectively speaking, you either accept that there are international waters that have certain rules and regulations, or you just say, I'll do whatever I want and I don't care about international law. So, I mean, even objectively speaking, one has to come to the conclusion that what the Israeli military did to the global Sumud flotilla, and I think this is the conclusion that European countries are coming to at the moment, was a violation of international law. So without looking at it from one side or the other, just objectively speaking. But let me go to one point that you mentioned about whether it was a success or whether it was not a success. It was not a success if we want to judge it. Did it actually break through to Gaza? Of course, that was not a success. But I think what it did do, it did raise the awareness of how Palestinians have been treated, and it made it much more visible for the world. So if we go back and we look, for instance, that there was this video leak, which was actually leaked by an IDF prosecutor, of the rape and torture of a Palestinian detainee at the State Taman detention center. So the perpetrators of that crime, they were acquitted of all charges by an Israeli court, whereas the prosecutor who leaked it was forced to resign and is now being charged. Then, of course, we have the UN report, which of 2024, which has determined that Palestinians are held like in cage-like facilities, they're stripped naked, they're blindfolded, deprived of food and sleep, et cetera, et cetera. So lots of activities which are not in line with human rights and which, of course, are illegal. The Israeli human rights group, B'Tselem, has said that all this is correct and has found that the systematic physical torture and sexual assaults of Palestinian detainees happens all the time. So now these activists have shone a light on this whole issue, whereas the Israeli government wanted to just ignore it and say, this is our issue. We treat our prisoners as we want. If we look at it from this point of view, one could say that this flotilla was successful. All of these people who were arrested and thrown in jail there and terrorized had to pay a really high price for this. But they really were able to raise the international awareness of what Israel does to the Palestinians. So my question is, should the UN really not be doing more here? They've already determined that what Israel is doing is absolutely false. Is this another failure of the UN?
The legally binding decisions are by the UN Security Council, and it is quite clear that if they wanted to take a decision against Israel, then this would be vetoed by the US, which is even clearer at this moment than it was in the past because the US is in a joint war with Israel against Iran. So there is no way that we can expect any kind of decision from the UN side that has any influence because of this veto mechanism. And I think this makes it very, very difficult for the UN to work properly. And we should be very careful in saying because now it's the law of the jungle that is ruling our world, we can forget about international law. We should not say that we don't want the UN anymore. So what does this mean? We should be very careful to not to throw the UN away, but to use the UN as one platform where we could engage in building the future world order without going through war. Because if we look at it from a historical point of view, we can see that during the 20th century, we had two world wars, and these two world wars were wars to define a new international order. And the outcome of both world wars was a new definition of the world order. So if we want to avoid having to go through a major war in order to eventually come to a new world order, I think we need to use the UN as a platform. At the same time, I also think that the UN, like any organization, like a state government, also follows the rule of bureaucracies growing and growing and growing. You see this in Brussels, you see this in New York, you see this all over the world. I think we will have to find a way to reduce this bureaucratic burden so that the UN can actually be impactful in those realms where it is really, really important and necessary, and maybe cut some of those UN organizations that do not really go to the very heart of this organization. And I think that the very, very important impact that the UN should be able to have is to avoid war and create a world order without war.
Well, I can only support what you just said. I think that should be the actual main mission of the United Nations. And before we move on to other topics, I want to actually ask my question again, which I asked after my introduction, namely whether Europe is moving together or not. So I got from your answer more or less that you don't believe that Europe moved together. But for instance, when the Israeli parliament voted at the end of March to introduce this death penalty for Palestinians accused of deadly acts of terrorism, which, by the way, does not apply to Jewish individuals, the UN issued a strong statement that the law perpetuates racial discrimination against Palestinians and amounts to grave erosion of human rights and urged Israel to immediately repeal that law. So when a society lacks due process and operates outside the rule of law, it is typically described as an authoritarian or totalitarian regime, characterized by arbitrary rule or a police state. Haaretz, an Israeli independent newspaper, has written extensively about Israel's descent into a police state. And of course, the treatment of the flotilla activists underscores this development. So I ask once again, the EU and the UK strongly criticized the death penalty law that Israel passed. Is this not another sign that Europe might be moving away from Israel? And will the EU finally suspend the EU-Israel Association Agreement? What is your opinion?
I'm not sure that this is going to happen because I think there are so many ties between Europe and Israel and the US. It's like a very special triangle that is in the working here that I do not expect for European countries actually to come to a consensus on this issue. It is very, very difficult for some of the European countries to try to criticize Israel more openly. And I think, for example, Germany at this moment has decided to go very much with the US in all kinds of policies, because obviously the government under Friedrich Merz can only survive the ongoing precarious situation if they align very closely with the Trump administration. And as long as they decide that they want to align very closely with the Trump administration, they will immediately also come to the opinion that it is not in their interest to criticize Israel or to go against Israel. So if you look at this situation, I think it's quite clear that there cannot be a consensus among European or European countries on this Israel issue. And that is the reason why I said, I don't think that there is going to be a consensus, even if some countries, like, for example, France, are being a little bit more critical about what is going on in Israel than other countries. But this shows that there is no consensus possible.
Okay, that's a clear statement. I'll take it. But let me stay with the topic of Germany now. So global studies show overwhelmingly people have negative views of Israel, and that Israel is now, objectively speaking, the most disliked nation of the world. That's what global studies have shown. The public perception of Israel has shifted in the West dramatically since Israel's genocidal war in Gaza and what it's now doing. Surveys indicate that roughly 2/3 of Germans hold a negative opinion of Israel, while only about 15 to 20% view the country as a trustworthy and favorable partner. Approximately 50 to 60% of Germans now reject the notion that Germany bears a unique historic obligation towards the Israeli state, given the actions of the current Israeli government. A large majority of the German public, reaching upwards of 65 to 70% in polls, considers Israel's military actions in Gaza to be inappropriate and disproportionate. And many of them actually call these actions genocide. Germany has always been Israel's strongest supporter in Europe, which you just mentioned also. Germany is a leader in Europe. France, Italy, and England are already much more critical of Israel than Germany. So, according to your opinion, do you think this will change, and will this affect Israeli-EU relations and German-Israeli relations, or will the Germans continue to support Israel no matter what?
From my personal point of view, I think the biggest mistake is to say, we Germans have a historical obligation to support the Israeli state no matter what happens. I think our historical obligation is actually to support the Jewish people wherever they live, whether in Israel or in any other place, because what we did was terrible against Jewish people, not against a Jewish state. So our obligation should be towards the people and not towards the state. This is my opinion. Of course, in this situation, this is very complicated because some people argue that only the existence of Israel as a state can actually be helping or supporting the survival of the Jewish people. And for that reason, the people and the state are very closely linked to each other. But this is also true for many other people in the world and peoples in the world. And I think it is quite important to sort of differentiate, because the people are not part of the state. They are, of course, ruled by the state, but they are not part of the state. And that's why they should be separated and looked at separately from the state. This is my opinion. And I think it is wrong to tell us Germans that, we always have to focus on the state. And as soon as we criticize the state, we are actually criticizing the people. We are not. We are not. So I think that is also a problem that these responders have to tackle when they're being asked. They're very often being asked whether they support the government in Israel, yes or not. And then they might come to a conclusion that they do not support what they are doing. And then this is interpreted as if they were criticizing Jewish people, which very often, sometimes this might be implied, but very often this is not implied. So this is a very, very tricky situation. So Germany is very, very active in pronouncing its idea that Germany should be the leading country in the EU. And for that reason, Germany should also be the leading country in supporting Ukraine. And for that reason, Germany also wants to be, or even bears the biggest burden in supporting the Ukraine financially. I think if you did a survey on all these claims among the German people, chances are very high that the majority would say, you know what, we do not support these ideas. But the government supports this idea. Why? They learn from Japan, where Prime Minister Sanai Takaichi told the US, you know what? I'm your best ally in the region. So if you support me, I can take over leadership in my region, which in the case of East Asia is not so easy. It's even more difficult than in Europe. Why? Because the other competitor for the leading position in East Asia is a country that is a little bit bigger than Japan, both in terms of territory and in terms of economic and in terms of military capacity, right? That is the reason why Sanai Takaichi says, if we want to take over leadership in East Asia, the US has to back us. And it is the same logic that the government under Friedrich Merz is actually following. They know very well that Germany is not powerful enough to be the winner of a competition between France and to a certain extent between France, the UK and Germany. So they actually try to win the support of the US the way Israel won the support of the US in going against Iran, and the way Sanai Takaichi from Japan wants to win the support of the US in trying to develop power in East Asia that is bigger than China. So for that reason, of course, Friedrich Merz has to follow very, very closely what they want him to do in Washington. And they follow him very, very closely. And he, of course, also has a domestic issue here. He thinks that if he follows the Trump administration very closely, then he can avoid for the Trump administration to support the AfD, the Alternative für Deutschland, the so-called right-wing party in Germany that is gaining more and more support among the population. And so he tries to avoid the AfD taking over Germany by trying to do everything Mr. Trump wants for Germany to do. He's not very successful, I think. And very interestingly, his assessment of the situation tells him that he can be successful, and he overlooks all the signals where he is not successful. Starting with the domestic issue, people do not support this kind of policy. Secondly, in Europe, more and more countries are getting really, really nervous. The more Mr. Merz starts talking about Germany has to take over a leading position, it has to have the most powerful army in NATO and things like this. And last but not least, he doesn't seem to receive the signals from Washington that tell him that Mr. Trump is not very amused about what Friedrich Merz is doing. And if Mr. Trump decides that he wants to support the AfD more openly than he already does, then he will do this, no matter whether or not Mr. Merz is trying to be his best friend. So from my point of view, I think it is like a survival strategy on the side of the government that is generated from a domestic situation and generated from a situation within the global sphere. And because it's a survival strategy, it tends to be a zero-sum game. So you're either successful or you will lose, right? And I think that's not decided yet, but I think there are more signals that show us that he might not be successful than there are signals that show us that he might be successful.
So if I stay with the topic of Germany a little bit longer, the U.S. is actively reevaluating its global military commitments and troop presence in Europe. President Trump recently declared that he will remove 5,000 U.S. soldiers stationed in Germany. The reduction follows a public diplomatic rift, if we want to call it that, between U.S. President Donald Trump and German Chancellor Friedrich Merz over the U.S. military's exit strategy from Iran. What do you say to those who support a complete withdrawal of U.S. troops from Germany? Is Germany not an occupied country? Should Germany also not lean on the NATO so much? And should Germany not now learn to say no sometimes?
Well, first of all, I think that the interpretation that Donald Trump announced the withdrawal of 5,000 soldiers from Germany was a reaction to Friedrich Merz talking in a high school in Germany about Donald Trump not having an exit strategy. So I doubt that this is actually a reason why. And I think it was framed by media. They looked for a reason why. And at the same time, they want to criticize Friedrich Merz. And for that reason, they put these two things together. It is very clear that Donald Trump already talked about this issue during his first period in office. So maybe he was waiting for a good opportunity to repeat what had been at the back of his mind for a long time. So from my point of view, I think we shouldn't over exaggerate this. I think it is very clear that the US cannot afford the kind of policy it has been making all over the world. 900 different military bases all over the world is extremely costly, and we should not underestimate the financial and budgetary problems the US government is in. So from this point of view, it's very understandable. Secondly, the US actually also has good reasons to reduce its engagement in Europe, which does not imply that government is actually preparing to totally retreat from Europe. I don't think that this is the case. According to their own security strategy of November last year, I think what they're actually looking at is that the different regions of the world can rule themselves, but the US will do its best to find countries and politicians that are actually supporting the US and working on behalf of the US. And this is why we now see that Germany is trying to be Donald Trump's best friend. And that's why we see the same tendency also in Japan.
That's very important to draw these parallels, because the U.S. is totally overextended all over the world with all its military bases everywhere. And then we have these regional actors like Israel, for instance, who want to become local powers. And maybe Germany sees itself as being that local power in Europe, for instance. The title of our podcast has two distinct parts, which are connected. So we've discussed the flotilla which went to Gaza. And now the next part of our title is A Europe That Can Say No. For those of our listeners who don't know, this is a take on a 1989 essay co-authored by Shintaro Ishihara and Sony co-founder Akio Morati. The original essay was famous for its critical examination of the United States business practices and for advocating Japan taking a more independent stance on many issues, from business to foreign affairs. So the title refers to the author's vision of a Japanese government that is not a mere yes man to the United States. So if I now turn our discussion, which we already actually started, to security concerns, we come to the conclusion that some countries have to show restraint, whereas other countries seem to be able to do whatever they want. At the moment in our world today, this would probably apply to the US and to Israel. They break international law, violate human rights, attack other sovereign nations like Lebanon, Syria, and Iran. And in the case of Israel, been waging a war against the Palestinians in Gaza, which some have called a genocide. For others, like Russia, who invaded Ukraine, citing NATO's decision to accept Ukraine into its alliance, they're labeled an evil regime and a rogue nation. The U.S. has now attacked two nations, Venezuela and Iran, and analysts are predicting a U.S. invasion of Cuba after the U.S. maximum pressure campaign has led to the most significant fuel and energy shortages in Cuba in decades. The U.S. again is calling for regime change and has just recently indicted 94-year-old Raul Castro, who is, of course, Fidel Castro's brother, and a steady chorus of U.S. officials calling for the end of a communist regime. So how will Europe react if the U.S. invades or attacks Cuba? Will they unite and condemn the attack? Or will they again accept that some countries are more equal than others? Will Europe be able to finally say no to the US?
Well, if we start with the Japanese example, we must say that Japan has actually reacted to US imposements quite differently from Germany. So, for example, at the end of World War II, both Germany and Japan were asked to totally surrender. Unconditional surrender was the catchword at the time. And Germany, as a matter of fact, actually finally accepted this and surrendered unconditionally. Whereas Japan bargained with the US for a long time until they had finally agreed on what unconditional surrender could actually mean. And one of the reasons why they bargained for a long time was that the Japanese elites insisted that they could surrender to everything, but that they could not destroy their imperial system, which up until today is still in existence. Japan has an emperor as its representative. Of course, the emperor was downgraded from a political figure to a representational figure, but the system is still there. And it is part and parcel of Japanese identity. And because it is part and parcel of Japanese identity, the Japanese elites that actually started talking to the US even before the nuclear bomb was thrown on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they actually wanted to understand whether or not the US meant them to give up their imperial system if they actually complied with the demand for unconditional surrender. And they finally submitted an unconditional surrender that had this one condition, which is that they wanted to preserve their imperial system. And it was the emperor himself who actually announced all this to the population in Japan. So this shows that Japan, on the one hand side, seems to be extremely compliant with everything that the US tells them. And on the other hand, they have certain issues where they show that they have their own definitions and their own norms and their own way of looking at the world and at their own country. I don't see this existent in Germany. Germany surrendered unconditionally and did not preserve any conditions that would show the population in Germany that there is something beyond this unconditional surrender. And because of that reason, I can very well understand that there are certain people in Japan who actually want to say no every once in a while, and that they also know that they have the support of major parts of the population when they voice the idea that saying no would be of major importance for the well-being of the country. So if you look at these people who actually wrote this book, by the way, there's also a Chinese version for China Can Say No, which was only published a few years after the Japanese version was published. So the Japanese that wrote the book are part of an elite in Japan that has always held the opinion that their country is not a normal country because it doesn't have the right to do what they think is good, but they can only do what the US thinks is good. And of course, these people also realize that the US had come to the assessment that Japan was such a strong competitor that it might take over economic leadership in the world and reduce the US to a second position. And the US would definitely not allow for this to happen. And by imposing certain policies on Japan, Japan has virtually been in a malaise ever since at least the 1990s, when their bubble was destroyed by the kind of measures that the US had taken against them economically. Right. So there is no sign that we have such an elite in the western part of Germany. And the only tricky issue we are now encountering is the following: that despite the fact that the eastern part of Germany was eaten up by the western part, and Western norms and Western ideas and everything we had cultivated in the western part of Germany was imposed on the eastern part. So some people say, nothing is left from this special identity that the German Democratic Republic in the eastern part of Germany had actually created during the Cold War. But we see now, many years after reunification, that there are certain tendencies coming up in the eastern part of Germany that do not want to unconditionally surrender to the norms that were defined in the western part of Germany. And so now what we see is that the Western elite is already trained in this collaboration with the US, which is based on the idea of unconditional surrender and which is based on the idea of imposing a certain system on the situation in the western part of Germany so that Germany would never, ever again develop into a political system like during the Third Reich. This is one part of the elite that still very much clings to this idea, whereas there are people starting to articulate their ideas in the eastern part of Germany that cannot fully accept this kind of imposement. And for that reason, the situation is so precarious in Germany. You know, after so many years of reunification, we have this sort of small group of people in the eastern part of Germany that comes up with slightly different ideas. But I think that they are still not strong enough to say, no, they are not strong enough to say no, because the western part of Germany is so much stronger than the eastern part of Germany that it would be quite suicidal for them to oust themselves so openly that they would say Germany doesn't say no. And this is, of course, also true for the EU, because the EU is not a unified actor. It cannot be a unified actor because it was built as an alliance of nation states, and nation states have their own interests, and their interests are not identical. So from this point of view, we cannot expect the EU to really come up with a unified idea of saying no to what is happening in the US. I think that maybe developments in the US will rather destroy the EU than the EU come to the consensus to say no to the US.
So you think even if the US marches into Cuba, for instance, you think the EU will not do anything and just accept it?
We still need US support and the nuclear umbrella in order to avoid a major clash with Russia. And even from a Russian point of view, I think they would very much be intimidated by the idea that the Europeans can take decisions to go to war against Russia all by themselves without the US interfering into this decision. Why? Because the US obviously and very rationally tries to avoid a direct confrontation with Russia. This is also true for China, and this is true for Russia. So Russia doesn't want to go to war against the US, and the US doesn't want to go to war against Russia. But now we hear in Europe that many politicians think that war is unavoidable. And when you use this wording, war is unavoidable, you are not saying we expect a war to start from the other side, while you are also not saying we think we need to start a war against Russia. So you say it's unavoidable, right? In this situation, it is good for Russia that the US is still part of NATO. And to a certain degree, maybe even we Europeans can say, okay, maybe it's a good idea in order to avoid having to go to war against Russia, that the US is still here, because of course, Russia will also calculate that if Russia goes to war against Western Europe, it will not only be resisted against by Western European armies, but that the US might most probably also be interfering. So from this balance of power point of view, I think it would be totally wrong to use the situation in Cuba to say no to the US. Because from a European point of view, what is happening in Cuba is only of remote interest for our well-being here, right? And for that reason, you should not take a major disruptive decision with regard to your relationship to the US because of what is going on in Cuba. So from this point of view, I think a structural analysis of the situation tells us that Europe might say something, but they definitely will not go so far as to say, because now it's the third time that you are going against international law and intruding on the sovereignty of another country, because it's the third time, therefore we are now saying, no, we don't want to be in an alliance together with the US anymore. I don't think that this would be possible for Europe to happen.
Yeah, if we want to stay with Russia before moving on, the EU continues to stand with Ukraine. It's actually now suggested an accelerated path for EU membership for Ukraine. It's coming up with a special plan of so-called partial membership as early as next year. I don't know if that's going to move forward. As a bloc, it's increased its aid to Ukraine. I think we're at 200 billion since the Russian invasion. And European powers are urgently working to ramp up domestic defense and secure supply chains to compensate for maybe supply chain disruptions from the US. On the other hand, we have the US, which is pushing for a swift end to the Ukraine war. But now that the US is engaged in the war in Iran with Israel, it has shifted its focus away from Europe and from Ukraine. We see this also. Ukraine is no longer headline news all the time. Other topics have taken this spot. And it's unclear also now when there'll be another round of negotiations with Ukraine involving the Russians and Ukraine and the United States, because Donald Trump just has different priorities at the moment. On the other hand, if the EU has cut all ties with Russia, and so the question is, will Europe ever start talking to Russia again, or will this policy of sanctions and silence continue? Will the war escalate, and would the EU accept a peace which the US brokers with the Russians?
Well, I think we have to start talking to Russia. This is very clear. When this moment will have come, it's very difficult to assess at this moment, but sooner or later it will come. Secondly, I don't think that Europe is in a position to accept the outcome of a peace negotiation between the US and Russia. I think that this is something they cannot accept because it will kill them also domestically. They have been supporting Ukraine for such a long time. They cannot walk out of this without any consequences. So they will have to at least demand that they be part of these negotiations. And the same is also true for Ukraine. I think it is erroneous on the Russian side to believe that they can come to a conclusion or to a solution of the problem without having Ukraine be part of these negotiations. And to a certain degree, I think they have already realized that this is not the right way for them to come to a conclusion that is also good for them. They also believe in this law of the jungle. If the US agrees with us on some solution, then all the other actors simply have to comply with this solution. I think they have now learned that this was a miscalculation. Europe and Ukraine have to be part of these negotiations. But I think it is also quite unusual that a war should come to an end without a party facilitating this process that is not part of the conflict. And the US is very clearly part of the conflict. The EU is part of the conflict. Russia, of course, is part of the conflict, and Ukraine is part of the conflict. So as long as we have not agreed on an actor outside the conflict that can be part of this negotiation, I think it will be very, very difficult to come to a conclusion. To talk about a certain person from Europe, like Gerhard Schröder, I was quite astonished to hear Mr. Putin coming up with this suggestion, because I think Mrs. Merkel was also on the short list for this kind of mediation function. She said very clearly that if you don't have the backing of a whole state behind you in these negotiations, then you cannot achieve anything. She's totally right. I'm quite astonished that Putin came up with this suggestion. This kind of suggestion is a no-go solution. So we'll have to talk about a country taking over a mediation function. During President Trump's last visit to China, some people started discussing the idea whether or not China could be such a mediator. I think China did not say it wanted to be a mediator. It only said it wanted to be more active, which shows that it is very, very conscious of the fact that neither Russia nor Ukraine is interested in having China act as mediator. So this is a very interesting and very tricky constellation. But if you follow all the statements that Mr. Zelensky has already made on China, and then you will see that he always comes up with all kinds of stories that make China look really ugly among his population. President Putin has never said anything criticizing China openly, but I think there's also a difference of approach because he wants the interest of Russia to be fully fulfilled, whereas China says, we have to find a solution with which all actors can live because this is the only solution that will prevent yet another war from happening. So there is a difference of opinion here. And he also knows that there are people in his country that are not very happy with China's growing dominant economic position in Russia. So if he then gives a signal that he would accept China as a mediator, I think it would not be good for him domestically. So we'll have to wait and see how things develop. But I think there's no solution for Ukraine unless we have a mediator that is outside the conflict. And I was quite astonished to hear in a press conference that President Putin gave before he traveled to China, in which he said again that this conflict has to come to an end as soon as possible, which is 100% the wording that the Chinese use in this context. And secondly, he also said, and I think this is the first time he voiced anything like this, that he understands that a solution needs to be found that everybody can live with, which is actually also a Chinese way of putting this. So I think to a certain degree, this shows that he needed to give signals to Beijing that he was somewhat trying to listen to what they were saying, whereas in the past he did not give any signals like this. This might show us that he was under comparatively high pressure before going to Beijing, and he only stayed for one day, which shows that the situation is not totally relaxed in Russia. But on the other hand, it also shows that he might be moving a little bit more towards China as a possible mediator. And that would then reduce the situation to only the Ukraine not being happy or amused about China as a possible mediator. So maybe things are changing a little bit here.
And it would be difficult to think of another country that would have enough power and standing in the world to actually take over this position as mediator, because I don't think Pakistan would be able to do this for a European country. And since all the great powers would be talking to each other, China would definitely seem like a logical choice in this scenario. So it'd be very interesting to see how this develops.
Let me insert one sentence here. I think the Chinese have been very, very skillful in trying to keep away from this conflict, right? But at the same time, we must assess very realistically that there is enormous competition between the US, China, and Russia. And this competition makes it very difficult for China to actually define its own stance as being outside the conflict, although it is not directly involved. And it's, of course, less involved than the US, who also claims not to be involved directly, right? So maybe we would have to look at countries like India, Brazil, or Turkey. So Brazil, I think, is not experienced enough in these issues. So, and it's very, very far away. For India, I would say that they actually have a foreign minister that has been in office for a very, very long time. India is pursuing a foreign policy of multi-alignment. It has very good relations, at least with the US and Russia. It has de-escalated its conflicts with China. I think it doesn't have a very, very open conflict with Ukraine, although, of course, Ukraine is criticizing India for buying oil and gas from Russia. So they are a typical multi-alignment country that is an in-between country and a country with a very skillful diplomatic service and a very, very experienced foreign minister. So maybe India would be a country we should think about. Because, if you look at China, if China were successful in bringing this conflict to an end, it would make its global position rise to a much higher level in political terms than it is at this moment. And I think that both Russia and the US are not interested in having this happen. So that's why we will have to look beyond. And maybe India is a solution. Maybe Turkey is also a potential solution, because Turkey is also trying to position itself as sort of in between country. You know, it has very strong ties to BRICS. It has very strong ties to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And on the other hand, it's part of NATO. So I think maybe Turkey is not such a bad solution. And as we know, it has acted as a location in earlier periods of negotiations. It is the country with the second in NATO, so it's not a place that you can overlook. But maybe Turkey does not have the kind of experienced diplomatic service and foreign minister. And, you know, of course, the president is deciding everything there, you know. So this might cause some doubts about the ability of Turkey to act as a mediator. But maybe India would be a good idea.
Yeah, India might really be another alternative to China. And even though Turkey is, of course, playing a stronger and stronger role in the Middle East conflict and wanting to become more and more involved there, solving the problem there with Iran. So that will be very interesting to see how this develops. Of course, one issue which unites all the great powers, US, China, and Russia, is the Arctic. The Arctic. And of course, what do we have in Arctic? We have Greenland. And the US president has, of course, on a regular basis, is renewing his calls for U.S. control of Greenland. And the EU, on the other hand, is accelerating its efforts to define its own Arctic role and stop the U.S. from becoming more involved in Greenland. The European Union has now proposed nearly doubling its Greenland funding amid rising U.S. NATO tensions and growing its Arctic influence. So it's going to now contribute 530 million euros to Greenland. The EU has updated recently its Arctic strategy, focusing on heavily prioritizing geoeconomic security, energy independence, and critical raw materials, while establishing a new European Commission office in Greenland. And let us not forget that 3 member states of the European Union are, in fact, Arctic states, unlike China, which is not an Arctic state but wants to be part of the Arctic Council. The move comes as Donald Trump's envoy visits Greenland, and Washington continues pursuing strategic influence on the Arctic island. With the US, EU, Russia, and China all focused on the region, Greenland is rapidly emerging as a major geopolitical flashpoint in the global battle for Arctic power. How do you see this battle over Greenland developing? Will the EU be able to say no to the US ambition over Greenland?
Well, I think it is very important to first understand why Donald Trump is actually sort of insisting on the Greenland issue to be solved the way he wants it to be solved. So this is because the US is actually pursuing the typical strategy of a maritime empire. So for a maritime empire, actually the fact that you have a certain territory under your control is only of secondary importance. The most important thing, of course, is that you control the oceans. And why do you want to control the oceans? Because the usual way for maritime powers to actually project their power around the world is by having dominance in all major oceans. So in the past, the Arctic was not so important. Greenland was not so important because no vessels could actually go through this area because of the ice that they had to overcome there. And only Russia had the technological capacity actually to pass through this part of the world because of their enormously big icebreakers. So now the situation with climate change is changing. And now the US sees that if they don't hurry up, then they will not be able to actually control this part of the world. But as this is a very important connection line between the Northern Pacific and the Atlantic, the US has to make sure that it can control this area. And they think that Denmark will not be able to do this job for them. And of course, they also don't want Denmark and they don't want the EU to do this job because they think that if they reduce their presence in certain regions of the world, they do this because they want to underline the dominance over the oceans. So one of the reasons why they take soldiers away from certain regions, soldiers on the ground in certain regions, is because they need to focus on their ability to control major routes through the oceans. And this is what he has in mind. And I think nobody will come to a conclusion of the problem, having him impose his conclusion on us, unless we understand the strategic sort of calculation behind this and then position ourselves towards this strategic calculation. So from a European point of view, I think we are not able to dominate any region of the world, which is an ocean, including the Mediterranean, right? So we should be very realistic about this situation. And of course, come up with a solution that says it is totally okay for us that the US wants to make sure that it has something to say in this region, but we have to come to a conclusion that does not imply that the US has to take over Greenland. So as a matter of fact, I think in Davos, they somewhat also went into this direction. But it is also quite clear that Donald Trump not only has this one idea, but he has also several other ideas which are related to Greenland, which we can understand when we try to sort of analyze why he not only wants Greenland, but he also wants Canada, right? Although he's not talking about Canada so openly anymore, but he definitely said he wanted Canada and Greenland. So from my point of view, the idea is that he not only wants to control the oceans, but he also wants to show that even when the US retreats from certain regions of the world, it's still a world power. So he thinks that if the US is too small in comparison to Russia and China, then maybe people will come to the conclusion that the US is not a world power anymore. And in order to prohibit this from happening, I think he wants to enlarge the US, and therefore he also has territorial claims. And he also comes up with this idea of sphere of influence. Because if you follow an imperial policy, and what I'm saying here is that actually the US is following an imperial policy. And if you look historically at examples of imperial policies, you will understand that empires not only want to be big, but they also want a cordon sanitaire. They want a sphere of influence around them so that there is a certain distance between this empire and the next empire. Because so far we have never had a situation in world history where only one empire was ruling the whole world. Right? Even the unipolar moment was not exactly a moment where one empire was ruling the whole world. But especially when we are looking at several empires ruling the world, which can also be understood as a form of multipolarity, then these empires need to make sure that they keep a certain distance between their territories. And for that reason, they need spheres of influence. So when Mr. Trump talks about Canada, when he talks about Greenland, he, on the one hand side, pursues policies of a maritime empire, but on the other hand, he also wants to make sure that in comparison to the other two empires that are traditionally not maritime empires, but continental empires, he cannot be too small, right? Because the world perception of the US might suddenly be that the US is too small to be a world power. right? And that is the second, I think, the second aim he is pursuing. And for that reason, he is actually leading the US in a very, very delicate, if not dangerous situation. So, for example, historically speaking, Japan tried to be a maritime power, but then it decided it needed to have an influence on the East Asian continent. So suddenly it had to pursue a maritime solution and a continental solution simultaneously. And this ended in defeat. Japan was defeated at the end of World War II because it simultaneously pursued a maritime and a continental strategy. Right? And I think this is a very, very important example to study in detail what happens to a traditionally maritime empire when it thinks it also needs to pursue the strategy of a continental empire. Can they do it simultaneously? And I'm afraid if they actually retreat from the regions and try to build their empire in their geographical location, if they pursue the maritime strategy and the continental strategy simultaneously, there is reason to believe from historical example that they might be defeated.
So this is where Cuba and Panama comes in, I guess, when you say, because of course they've been clashing with China over Panama as well.
Yeah. Yes. I think Panama is very easy. I mean, even if they didn't have the problem with China, to put it that way, they need to control Panama because, first of all, this is in their sphere of influence. And secondly, it's a very important connection, right? A very, very important connection. And you don't want your main competitor to actually dominate this connection, you know. And if you look at China, very interestingly, the Belt and Road Initiative is an initiative of continental connectivity. So it's actually an initiative that avoids maritime dominance. Why? Because they realize that the oceans are being dominated by the US. So that's why they try to build railroads wherever they can in order to avoid having to go through oceans that are being dominated by the US. The US tries to lure China into becoming more active with its navy because they want to see what China's navy actually is able to show. But China shies away from this because they know how dangerous it is to be a maritime power and a continental power simultaneously. And they don't think that they have built up enough capacity to do more than dominating the oceans in direct vicinity to their country, which is the South China Sea, of course, and which is the East China Sea, where we have the Taiwan problem, where we have the South China sea problem. So they actually have this idea that they want to push the US out of their sort of front garden, right? And they do not want to do more in terms of engagement with their navy around the world. We will wait and see whether this is a successful policy because, you know, they also said, you know, we have a maritime version of our Belt and Road Initiative. So there might be some people who say, you know, in our today's world, the only thing we can do is we can pursue two strategies simultaneously. On the one hand side, we need to go for a maritime power strategy. And on the other hand side, we will go for a continental power strategy. Then all three powers are again in the same position and all three powers are met with the same kind of difficulty and the risk that is implied.
And of course, the Belt and Road Initiative and the fact that China can get goods from Iran, not through its maritime routes, but through railways, is helping it now during the Hormuz blockade. So it's actually, it turned out to be a wise decision on China to have that second route, not only through the water, but also through the land itself.
Yeah.
I wanted to turn now as a final section of our discussion today to the other point which binds the US and Europe, which is, of course, trade. That's a really big part of the relationship between these two blocs. And the European Union reached a late night provisional deal on Tuesday, this past Tuesday, to remove import duties on US goods, which is a key part of the bloc's trade pact with the United States. This kept the EU on track to meet President Trump's July 4th deadline and avoid higher US tariffs on European goods. The EU Commission is praising the deal, which, of course, Ursula von der Leyen was instrumental in finalizing. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz said the agreement showed the bloc was, quote, delivering on its commitment and provided more security and stability for our businesses. But I ask myself, what is so great about a deal that levies 0% tariffs on US imports and allows the US to impose 15% tariffs on EU imports? In addition, the EU pledged $540 billion with a B in investments into the United States, which is its largest trading partner. So if we stay with the theme of our discussion, can Europe say no? Has the EU given into US bullying? And of course, the EU has recently concluded or is about to conclude trade deals with all sorts of different countries, from Australia to Chile to China, the Mercosur deal, Mexico, Philippines, UAE, etc. So the EU is looking to expand and become more independent from the US export markets. So how do you assess this?
Well, if we go back to last year, I think this deal was actually made after Ursula von der Leyen had made a visit to China, a visit that was reported in our media over here as being a very unfriendly visit, in the sense that the Chinese did not do anything that Ursula von der Leyen wanted them to do. And Ursula von der Leyen gave a press conference without Chinese participation at the end of her visit in China, showing that she actually saw China as a major threat to the well-being of Europe. And so she gave a signal to Donald Trump, who was at that moment very much focused on trying to isolate China from its worldwide trade relations. So she was giving a signal to Donald Trump that, the EU was willing to sacrifice its relationship with China in order to achieve something better from the deal with the US. Interestingly, Donald Trump did not really reply to this kind of theater that Ursula von der Leyen had played. Maybe he wasn't even aware of this. You can't even count on the White House being aware of all these things at this particular moment. So he actually did not praise Mrs. von der Leyen for her very courageous stand against China. And that was the result she achieved last year. And I think if these things had taken place this year, she might have achieved something else. But it is very clear tactically for the US side that this deal was very, very good for the US, not so good for the EU. And therefore, the US has to insist that this deal actually has to be taken for granted. Right. So the whole idea that one could enter a deal with the US counting on something might happen in terms of change of the political leadership in the US or something, all this has not worked up to the expectations of the leadership in Brussels. And for that reason, objectively speaking, they are now in an asymmetric situation in which they have to accept things which are not good for them, while the US is being offered things that are really good for them. So this is an asymmetric situation, and there is, realistically speaking, that's the way it is. And it is a consequence of the EU trying to use this deal in order to signal to the US its hope that the US would still support Ukraine, its hope that the US would not withdraw more soldiers from Europe, and its hope that the US would not withdraw from NATO. The whole deal is part of this geopolitical setting. And for that reason, it is very rational from the Brussels side to accept unfavorable conditions from the US in order to achieve this overall game of convincing the US that they cannot walk away from Europe.
Yeah, so once again, the Europeans have not managed to say no. So we'll see how that pans out in the long run. So another 1-0 for the US here. So Europe's not doing too well here in our discussion, I have to say. So as a final question, when we bringing China into the discussion, which you already did with Ursula von der Leyen's visit over to China, the EU made clear that moving away from the US, or maybe not moving away, but rediverting some of its trade away from the US, let's put it that way, does not mean moving close to China. And after the EU Commission proposed the Industrial Accelerator Act, China, of course, heavily criticized this act because it would be a major impact on China's trade relations with the Europeans. In April, China's State Council enacted the Provisions on Industrial and Supply Chain Security, which instructs its companies not to comply with EU investigations or sanctions. It also cut off dual supply use to 7 European defense contractors over Taiwan and made explicit threats over the EU's proposal on its Industrial Accelerator Act and its Cybersecurity Act. So if the EU wants to diversify from the US, but is also moving away from China and has already cut all ties to Russia, where does that actually leave the EU? Because the EU relies on China for so many important products, pharmaceuticals, rare earths, et cetera, technology. Do you think that the EU will back off from its protectionist stance to appease China?
I think that there is a fierce fight going on within the EU and between different elites, especially the political elite and the business elite in Europe on this issue. I think if you look at the major international companies in Europe, especially in Germany, you see that they very strongly opt for a close relationship with China. VW, BMW, BASF, everybody is investing in China. And they think that China and East Asia, including Southeast Asia, will be their future and not Europe. So from their point of view, no solution for Europe if Europe tries to isolate itself from all 3 major powers, from the US, from Russia, and from China. And I think the reason why they think in Brussels that this might be a solution to the problem is because they regard themselves as a major power, not knowing that all major powers in this world do not regard Europe as a major power. So this implies that Europe, that always criticizes those people in the US that pursue an isolationist policy, actually is now pursuing an isolationist policy, which I repeat, is not supported by everybody, especially not by the leading companies in some of the European countries. And for that reason, I don't think that this leadership in Brussels will be able to go on for a long time because they are tied into the logic of their policies of the past, which is why it is very difficult for them to tell us now that, you know what, we somewhat miscalculated the situation in the past, so maybe we change now. It's very difficult for one and the same person to actually come up with such a statement. So we will have to wait for a change in leadership in Brussels for other people to come up with other solutions than Mrs. von der Leyen has come up with in the past. And I personally think that this policy of self-isolation is a very hazardous policy, both with regard to our political position in the world, our military capacities, and our economy. So I think we do need to have a change here. And I think that the change should go into the direction, absolute opposite direction, which is we should try to develop a form of diplomacy that actually enables us to come to a solution for all, or at least many of the many problems that we are being confronted with at this time, by actually talking to all 3 major powers and also to other so-called middle powers like Turkey, like India, like, of course, Canada, Australia. So I think Europe should open itself to everybody to talk to Europe rather than trying to close in and isolate the continent from the rest of the world.
Well, I think that's a really good summary of our discussion today. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we close our discussion, Suzanne?
Yes, maybe we can say that the situation for Europe is very dangerous, is very precarious at this moment. And if the leadership does not come to a realistic assessment of the situation, it might be prone to make major mistakes, very much to the detriment of us people living in Europe. And so, for that reason, I think it is very important that we have these discussions. Of course, the European Union gives us the impression that they are now having all kinds of treaties with countries from the global south, which is totally okay, but which also shows that they're desperately looking for friends around the world as they are losing the friendship or something that is at least a working relationship to the three major nuclear powers, which, as I just said, is very dangerous.
Absolutely. And if I may add to that, one should also discuss at some point whether the EU itself might need some reform, because maybe one of the issues is that we just don't have the right leadership. And maybe the reason why we don't have the right leadership in the EU is because the EU itself, as an organization, if we want to call it that, is not very democratic, because no one really elected Ursula von der Leyen for her position, or the people who run the EU with her. So maybe that would also give us better leaders at the top who would see new directions to take us in, and we wouldn't be in the situation we're in.
Hmm. Well, unfortunately, I'm not very convinced that if an organization becomes more democratic, it will immediately solve its problem. I think that the democracy issue is an issue, but that we have more structural problems to solve before we then can go on and think about, what parts of the EU can and should be more democratic than they are at this moment, and what other parts maybe we should simply get rid of. So I think we first have to analyze the situation of the European Union from a realistic and structural point of view, then analyze the internal situation of the EU, and then come to the conclusion which things need to be reformed, which things we simply should get rid of, and which things we can keep for the future to come.
I think you're absolutely correct in that, but sometimes one really has the feeling that the EU is regulating past the citizens, and that's where I think this democratic issue might become more
Yeah.
important, because
Yeah.
often one feels like the EU leadership just has no idea what the people in the European Union actually want, and maybe the policies would reflect the will of the people more and wouldn't be, legislating past what actually
Yeah.
would be more important to the European public.
Mm. The EU actually thinks they know what is good for us, so they don't need to listen to us.
Yeah, you're right about that one. Well, thank you very much. This has been a very, very interesting discussion. Maybe it didn't quite lead to where it should have led regarding the EU, but it was a very realistic discussion of where we're at the moment. Thank you very
Yeah.
much. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in to another session of iGlobe Views. Remember to like and subscribe, and we hope you'll tune in to our future discussions as well.
Bye-bye, and thank you for the conversation. It was wonderful.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye-bye.